From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's ahead. K-State's Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz will talk about planting time nutrient management for corn, why you growers might consider a split nitrogen application, and what to account for when using a starter fertilizer with the seed. Then K-State's Brian Briggeman will offer his latest thoughts on the macroeconomic fallout from COVID-19 as it would impact you agricultural producers. This from one of those online public forums hosted last week by K-State Agricultural Economics. Another meeting in that series is set for this evening. And on this week's horticulture segment, K-State's Cheryl Boyer is back to talk about how local garden centers are accommodating home gardeners' needs in these times of social distancing. All that coming up on Agriculture Today.
With the shortage of primary care physicians, especially in rural areas, health education and disease prevention are vital. K-State research and extension programs address quality of life, personal development, and health behaviors across all life stages of all social economic groups. To learn more about health education, one of K-State Research and Extension's 5 grand challenges, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, our Thursday edition. We'll get right to our first topic today, which would be managing nutrients ahead of and during corn planting. Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz is with us, crop nutrient specialist, K-State Research and Extension. He joins us via phone today. And Dorivar, we just might remind folks that the soil testing laboratory at K-State, despite all of the interruptions caused by COVID-19, that laboratory is still open for business to assist producers in analyzing their field nutrient status.
Yes, Eric, thank you, and thank you for that reminder. Yes, the soil testing lab at K-State is taking accepting samples. We are processing essentially regular turnaround time. So a little bit of a challenge right now is in terms of mailing and maybe a little more delays and taking a little more time for the samples to get to us. But once it's in the lab, again, it's essentially regular working hours for us. And so we are making good progress on that. So again, if you're thinking about soil testing that you need to complete yet this spring, yes, we are working on those samples that you are submitting.
And work with your local extension personnel, and they can assist you in trafficking that sample to K-State for analysis. But they need to work through specific means of getting those to the campus and back because of COVID-19 and the complications there. It's not the normal procedure, but accommodations have been made so that producers can still submit those samples, you tell us.
Yes, Eric, that's correct. And the local extension office, they do have some options in terms of drop-off location for soil samples, and then they will get it to us. So that's one option. Also, if you prefer, you can send the samples directly to the soil testing lab using our shipping labels. If you go to our website, you can print those and essentially send it via UPS, and that will get to us usually the next day. Another option is if you're not far from Manhattan, we do have a Dropbox location outside of Throckmorton, and so that's also indicated in our website. And those are good options to get the samples to us. And again, once the sample is in our lab, we are getting analysis run pretty much in normal schedule.
About corn nutrient management now, and already we see and have seen a number of farmers out there getting about their pre-plant nitrogen applications for corn, haven't we?
Yes, Eric, it's the time of the year. Obviously, we have different options for nitrogen management in corn, and many producers are perhaps doing primarily pre-plant applications using different sources, and hydros, of course, it's been going spring and hydros application for the most part the last few weeks. But we do have several options there, especially one of the things that we probably need to think about, and thinking a little bit about what happened in 2019 as well, a little bit wetter years. We did have some level of nitrogen losses in many parts of the state with the excess moisture. And so the question is, should we be putting all that nitrogen pre-plant or Should we consider other options, a split application? And what is the value of that split application? And that is a question I think we should consider at this point, and as we're thinking about that nitrogen program and maximizing nitrogen use efficiency for that corn crop.
Split in applications then. What is the most sensible split? What percentage can one put on later on in a practical way here?
Yes, Eric, that's the key point and in terms of making that decision. And we have to keep a few things in mind. Obviously, at this point, hopefully we already have a plan on hand in terms of what application rates we're going to be putting for that corn based on previous information that we have. And so the question is how much of that nitrogen we need to apply. And when we're talking about split application of nitrogen, we have a couple options. We have the traditional early side dress, which typically happen around the V6, V8 growth stage. So that's really before we have a lot of the nitrogen uptake in corn. We have to keep in mind that really most of the nitrogen uptake, really rapid nitrogen uptake is happening after about V8. Okay, so once you're in that, between that growth stage of V8 to tassel, basically we are taking up most of the nitrogen at that point during that time. So if we do early side dress, and that basically what we're planning to do, then that would be earlier before we take up all of that nitrogen. So we can cut back significantly on the application rates at this point. And in many cases, really, we may just need some starter fertilizers at this point and essentially come back around V6 and put the balance of that nitrogen. That's one option. Now, the second option, and this is something that many producers are doing more and more, is late application. And when I say late application, we're talking getting to about the reproductive stage, close to tassel. Of course, that's different challenges there, and some producers may be able to do that fairly easily if they do have irrigation system. Obviously, that would be an easy way, or if they have a way to do that application later. Now, if we're doing that late application of nitrogen, then we will need to apply a fair amount of that nitrogen ahead of time, essentially now or early side dress, and just leave a fraction of that nitrogen for later in the season. And typically, for example, if we're talking about, say, 200 pounds application rate, we may want to leave somewhere around 40 pounds for that late application. And so that's one approach. And the benefit of that really is that it gives us the flexibility to make adjustments for that late application. And that will depend on potential for nitrogen losses that we may have during the growing season, or if we do have better conditions and yield potential maybe is going up, we can make some adjustments to that application. And again, thinking back a little bit of what happened last year, we did see some benefits in many cases with this approach. Again, because in many situations, maybe we lost a significant amount of nitrogen, so we needed to make adjustments later in the season. On the other hand, also just by splitting that nitrogen, we already been more efficient. Essentially, we're putting that nitrogen when it's needed and minimizing any potential risk of nitrogen losses. So just that right application timing, essentially, by split applying, we're already making an improvement in management in general. And so those are some things to think about. Now, the question obviously is, are we going to see a yield benefit all the time to split application? Mm-hmm. And the answer to that is no. There's going to be situations where we're going to tend to see more consistent benefits. And there are going to be other situations, especially some parts of Kansas, where pre-plant applications is just as good as split application. And again, that depends on weather conditions, soil types, and just that risk of nitrogen losses that we may have. And again, just to put a little bit in context, we're thinking about sandier soils or heavy clay soils in southeast Kansas. Those are going to be situations where split application will tend to benefit. And that's basically what our research shows last year. Those situations, we are seeing consistent benefit to split application. Now, you go to a more fine texture soils that typically are not prone to nitrogen losses. And in those situations, we may not always see that yield benefit. So, again, it's a little bit more related to that risk of nitrogen losses.
Well, for good reasons, the emphasis is typically on nitrogen, but we don't want to forget other potential nutrient needs of that new corn stand. Phosphorus has to be considered as part of that starter, for example.
Yes, Eric, and that's another key point that we need to be thinking about this right now. when we're thinking about a starter fertilizer, phosphorus would be the one that will tend to show the most benefit. Phosphorus provides some key benefits in terms of plant growth early in the season, root development, and those are key components that we really need for that corn to have a faster growth early in the season, establishment, and basically a better start to the season. So we need to be thinking about those, what kind of situations going to show the most benefit to starter fertilizers. And this is important because we may or may not see a yield benefit to starter fertilizers, again, depending on the situation. And typically, if we are talking about a lower soil test phosphorus situation, I think we should be thinking about starter fertilizer applications. We do have flexibility in terms of placement. Some producers like to do more in-furrow pop-up applications. That's an excellent option. Obviously, we are a little bit more limited in terms of the application rates. Some producers still use 2x2, and we do have a lot of people that also like to use dribble on the surface that shows similar results, especially with higher application rates. So again, phosphorus will be a key nutrient there in those low testing soils. Other situations where we tend to see more consistent yield benefits also is in no-till systems with heavy residue. Soil temperatures will tend to be a little bit lower, and also we tend to have that heavy residue maybe tying up some nutrients early in the season. So again, having that benefit starter fertilizer in no-till is really important. And also, again, for people that may be planting corn a little bit earlier, we do have some differences there. Some producers are maybe pushing planting dates a little bit late, depending on where they are in the state. And in those situations, obviously, the starter fertilizer may not show as much benefit. But for early planting, of course, definitely a benefit from starter fertilizers.
Very well. Well, the growing season is upon us, so Dorivar will have you back to talk more crop nutrient management as we forge further into the planting season, not only for corn, but for grain, sorghum, soybeans, other primary crops in Kansas. For these comments on corn nutrient management, we appreciate it, and we'll catch up with you again soon. Take care.
Thank you.
Dorivar Ruiz-Diaz is a crop nutrient specialist with K-State Research and Extension. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
A social distancing tip.
Keeping your distance from others is important in slowing the spread of coronavirus. So here are some fun things to do alone. Read a book, take a walk, unpack your suitcase from that trip you took last September, paint a self-portrait, catch up on a TV series, do a puzzle. Remember, we should all stay home to lower the risk for everyone. For more info, visit coronavirus.gov.
Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
We're back now on Agriculture Today. This evening, K-State Agricultural Economics will continue its weekly series of online gatherings, as they're calling them, focusing on the economics of agriculture during this COVID-19 pandemic. This series opened last Thursday with K-State agricultural economist Brian Briggeman discussing the latest on the macroeconomy and what's going on there of direct relevance to the agricultural sector. Right here, we wanted to share some of Brian's observations and the responses to participant questions from this forum, just to give you an idea of what this interactive series is all about.
Thinking about, interest rates and looking at inflation is how does this tie back into agriculture? So here, working with Alan Featherstone, he collects the farm credit bond rates over time. And it's interesting to show this because I think there's some real takeaways that many of you producers and agribusinesses who are on the call, on the webinar here, have probably seen. The first thing I would draw attention to, and I know many of you all have seen this because I've talked to many producers about refinancing their loans, long-term notes, acquiring, making a purchase and getting a great long-term rate that's very cheap. Well, if we look starting right around in 2019, those farm credit bond rates, especially on longer-term bonds, and then all the other bonds begin to decrease. And what that has an effect on is the interest rates that we would pay as a producer or an agribusiness on borrowed money, in particular here from farm credit. Now, a lot of that has been, driven down by, the Fed back in October 2019, started buying treasuries again to try to help provide some support to the economy, and that helped to push those rates down. But if we look at where we're at now, we've just recently seen a snapback up, where we see those farm credit bond rates have begun to increase. And if we look at the spread between farm credit bonds and the Treasury bill spread, before we saw the spread, so the difference between a farm credit bond and a Treasury bill, to see that there was a bit of risk in agriculture, above what would be considered the risk-free rate, which is the U.S. Treasury rate. We see that spread has spiked to where U.S. Treasuries have fallen, but we're actually starting to see those farm credit bond rates increase. Will this trend continue? Will we see those rates for producers begin to go up? That's one thing that we'll have to monitor and follow. And on that point, why is that happening? What is going on? Why would agriculture have a higher rate? This is a question I don't have a good answer, but it's something that we need to be thinking about. So when we think back to previous economic downturns, how are we positioned today? How is the agricultural industry positioned today? I know when we were going into the 2008 financial crisis, ethanol was coming on. We had growing global economies. If you remember back then, there was a lot of discussion around how are we going to feed this growing world? And also this growing world is having additional amounts of income. So they're going to be changing their diets, eating more protein. We're going to need to feed those livestock. There was a lot of demand pull that was there ready to pull up our prices. The outlook for ag, at least during that time, looked pretty good. How are we today? What is it looking like today? I know a lot of the reports, and Dan can certainly go to more discussion on ethanol and grain prices, and Glenn can talk about livestock. But I think there are some real questions that we need to be asking ourselves as an agricultural industry as we move into this economic downturn. I think for us, we need to be thinking about what are good, sound farm management practices. How can we make sure that we are managing our farm, our cooperative, our independent seed retailer, bank, whatever it may be? We need to follow good, sound financial management, and we need to put an emphasis on liquidity. We have got to build up that part of our balance sheet to where we have that quick funds capital available to us to get through this time. The last part that I would add before opening up to some questions, and I see I got a question on the chat, and I'll get to that. But this came in as an early question and I want to, because I did reach out to talk about our supply chains. So I have work a lot with farmer cooperatives, not just here in Kansas, but throughout the United States. And I reached out to that network to say, well, with this potential disruption at ports, what does this mean for chemicals? What does this mean for seed? What does this mean? Because we're heading into the planting season. Can we get this crop in the ground? And from the cooperative network that I reached out to, what I heard is that there's not a lot of concern about meeting the demands and needs now. As planting gets rolling, as we get started, the chemical, seed, fertilizer, all that should be there now. As if this pandemic continues and we continue to have some disruption, that could affect our supply chain and could raise those prospects looking forward of, will that supply be there? So we need, unfortunately, more information. But from what I have heard right now, that's therefore available to get planting rolling going forward. And so I do have a question here, and I'll address it. If inflation does begin to heat up with all of this new money, will it not put pressure on the Fed to raise interest rates to put on the brakes? If we do have that new money flow into the economy very rapidly, and we do have that pent-up demand that comes and starts chasing, and we have all this access to free credit, that could happen. That is a scenario. By definition, inflation is too much money chasing too few goods. Now, I do want to clarify, and we also know, we learned from Paul Volcker that the way you fight rampant inflation is you target the money supply, you restrict it, and you just let interest rates go through the roof. And nobody wants to go there. Now, the one thing that I always want to clarify with what the Fed is doing with their balance sheet, and as they're expanding it very rapidly, those funds cannot enter into the commercial banking sector. If they did, that would be without question too much money. However, they control that. It's excess reserves that are held at the bank, but they cannot lend on those. So those funds will not enter into the market. So the question, would be is we've got to have growth. We've got to come back for that. From Daryl, the question is, what's your opinion on potential for consolidation in the ag sector to ethanol farming and ranching? If we continue to have depressed net farm incomes, if we continue to see, the competition, the expense, the scale, I think that is part of the future as we begin to adopt a lot more technology and start to put that to use. I know a colleague of mine, Terry Griffin, has a lot of discussion and good stuff out there on precision agriculture and using technology. It's only going to ramp that up. We won't need as many folks to farm as much because the ground is without question going to be farmed. It'll just look different than we have seen in the past. And those are all things that are going to fuel that consolidation across the board within agriculture. We've seen it happening now, and it's only going to continue, would be my opinion and my projection going forward.
Brian, I had a question that was sent to me on the private chat. They'd like your opinion on what this large financial stimulus will do to the value of the U.S. dollar. And I'll quote, "I would think all else being equal that the U.S. dollar would move lower. But if other economies are all in catastrophe or at risk, the U.S. dollar may stay relatively strong compared to other currencies. This has an impact on U.S. ag exports."
Yeah, exactly right. Yes, we would think with the stimulus going on would help push it down. But what we're seeing is this flight to safety is beginning to happen. So we're actually seeing the value of the dollar is increasing, is going up. So yes, you're right. That is going to have an effect on us on ag exports, but it goes back to that supply chain disruption. If we don't get this thing under control and we can't get our products out, it's not really going to matter a whole lot what our prices are. If you think about cotton, I know the textile industry in India is taking a big hit right now. And looking to start shutting down manufacturing plants. So that definitely will have a negative, well, it should. I haven't checked cotton prices lately, but I would imagine that would have an effect on those and negatively impact our cotton farmers. But yes, we are seeing currently actually the value of the dollar go up because of all the disruption everywhere else, and people are flocking to us as a safe haven.
K-State agricultural economist Brian Briggeman. Incidentally, the other voice you heard there was of fellow agricultural economist at K-State, Rich Llewellyn, who is managing this series. The next session is tonight at 7 o'clock, and it'll feature K-State's Dan O'Brien on the grain market impacts of COVID-19. Similar format, a short presentation, then a wide-open discussion revolving around that topic. These are limited to 300 participants at a time, so if you'd like to be part of it, you need to pre-register right away. No fee whatsoever, and you can file your questions in advance if you'd like. Take care of all of that at agmanager.info. Again, agmanager.info. We'll return after this break. You are listening to Agriculture Today.
Social distancing slows the spread of coronavirus, so if you have a fever, dry cough, and shortness of breath, call your healthcare provider before going in. More info at coronavirus.gov. Let's all do our part, because we're all #AloneTogether. Brought to you by the Ad Council.
Coming to you from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson here. Next up, today's agricultural news headlines. courtesy in part of DTN. Well, yesterday, the U.S. Department of Labor announced new action on how American workers and employers will benefit from the protections and the relief offered by the Emergency Paid Leave Act and the Emergency Family and Medical Leave Expansion Act, both of those part of that Families First Coronavirus Response Act. The department's Wage and Hour Division posted a temporary rule issuing the regulations pursuant to the new law. This reimburses American private employers that have fewer than 500 employees with tax credits for the cost of providing employees with paid leave for specified reasons related to COVID-19. The law enables employers to keep their workers on the payrolls while at the same time ensuring that workers are not forced to choose between their paychecks and the public health measures needed to combat the virus. Quoting here the Wages and Hours Division Administrator Cheryl Stanton, with so many workers and so many employers struggling with the effects of these unprecedented conditions, this rule provides answers and relief. The actions by the Federal Reserve Board in response to COVID-19 have now translated into a rather direct impact for agriculture, reducing the borrowing costs for those getting marketing assistance loans from the Farm Service Agency. The interest rate on commodity loans dispersed in April will be 1.625%. That's down 2.5% from March. Plus, the stimulus package extends the maturity on the loans for an additional 3 months, taking that to 12 months. The rates on farm storage facility loans also declined markedly for April, falling to 0.75% to 1.25%, depending on the length of the loan. Those were at 1.375% to 1.625% in the month of March. As technology and innovation advances on the farm and ranch, so does the need to have high-speed broadband in place to take full advantage of those systems and equipment. Here's a glance at that from the USDA's Rod Bain.
The need for high-speed e-connectivity in rural areas, particularly those reliant on agriculture, becomes more evident with each introduction of new technologies. Consultant Bob Knight at this year's USDA Agricultural Outlook Forum says programs like USDA's Reconnect are necessary in building broadband infrastructure to allow producers to work in the field. For instance,
autonomous tractors. And you can see what all the suppliers have. Data-driven decisions are happening at the farm. Precision agriculture is great for the environment. If you have a circle and you're able to monitor the soil and how much water it needs, you're using less water and you're precisely delivering irrigation to the crops. We don't know what's to come in terms of robotics, automation.
But Knight adds lack of broadband service in some rural areas also impact how growers make transactions.
The farmer has to drive to the parking lot of McDonald's to poach Wi-Fi to connect with suppliers, to check the numbers. That's not sustainable.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Well, given all of the market irregularities of late, are U.S. beef and pork producers losing sales to substitute meat products? The USDA's Gary Crawford reports.
Beef and pork producers have voiced concerns about so-called meat substitutes, veggie burgers and such, replacing a significant share of beef and pork's market in the U.S. However, the way it's working right now,
they tend to not be so much a replacement as an addition to.
Andy Harrig with the Food Marketing Institute says, according to his group's extensive consumer surveys, sales of meat products at supermarkets are not going down, even as sales of substitute meat products are going up.
So it doesn't look like in the early stages anyways that's necessarily going to drive down consumption.
Harrig says there are younger shoppers, yes, who are concerned about issues like sustainability and animal welfare, but it usually takes a long time for major changes in the U.S. diet to be made.
So I tend to think this is probably not a 10-year horizon, but a much longer one than that before we start to see any kind of significant changes.
In Washington, Gary Crawford for the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
And while there's been no official comment from the U.S. Trade Representative's office, it does not appear now that the U.S., Canada, and Mexico have notified each other via letters that they have taken the needed shifts to laws and regulations to align those with the provisions of the U.S.-Mexico-Canada trade agreement. That agreement cannot be entered into force until those notifications take place, so it suggests the earliest the deal could now take effect might be July the 1st. Now for you, this week's Kansas soybean update with Greg Akagi. Greg?
Jeremy Olson is joining us. He is an agronomist from Everest, Kansas, and was part of the American Soybean Association's Corteva Young Leader Program. Jeremy, what got you interested in wanting to participate in the Young Leader Program?
I had a couple friends go through the program a few years ago, and they had great experience with it, and just the ability to network with people that do very similar things and that are committed to the soybean industry. And, I mean, really, yeah, like I said, it's all about a networking team approach and a learning ability.
Well, besides networking, which, of course, is extremely important, what were some of the highlights in participating in the program?
I would say one of the major highlights was we went through a communicating with others 2-hour-long session in Indianapolis in December, and that was a really good session for, communication between people that, may not have the same, values or core values, and to try to have conversations with consumers, not necessarily just farmer to farmer, but communicating with the consumer.
And as you look back, is there a biggest thing or a big thing that you've taken away from being a part of this program?
The biggest thing for me is to go along with those communication lines is being the voice for not necessarily just the soybean industry, but in agriculture in general for my age group, which is around, 30, being that voice and the communication part of it is going to be extremely important.
And will this lead to maybe a leadership role in the Kansas Soybean Commission or Soybean Association, or maybe even higher than that?
Yeah, definitely. I think it definitely has committed me to, being a part of the Kansas soybean and, to try to help in any way along with the farmers that I am in contact with every day.
Jeremy, I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Greg.
That is Jeremy Olson, an agronomist from Everest, Kansas. He was a part of the American Soybean Association's Corteva Young Leader Program, and he joins us on the Kansas Soybean Update. It's brought to you by the Kansas Soybean Commission.
Thanks, Greg. Greg Akagi there, and this is Agriculture Today.
Did you know every Kansas farmer feeds 128-plus people?
Kansas farmers are hard workers, dependable, authentic, and sensitive.
Not only do farmers put food on your table, but they put clothes on your back and fuel in your car.
For more information about Kansas farmers, visit K-State Research and Extension online or stop by your local Extension office. This message has been brought to you by the K-State Animal Sciences Leadership Academy participants.
Agriculture Today is back now, and for our weekly horticulture segment, we pick up on our conversation we began last week with Cheryl Boyer, Extension State Leader in Horticulture at Kansas State University, and everything is revolving around how folks adapt to the coronavirus situation in this country. And last week we talked, Cheryl, about what Extension is doing here in Kansas to continue that flow of information to home gardeners through all of this. But we wanted as well to take a look at what the commercial gardening sector is doing in that respect. And obviously they're having to adapt. What are some of the things you're observing there?
Well, so a lot of our garden centers are adapting very quickly to curbside pickup situations. So they are developing websites that have photos of their products and the ability to pick them out, pay for it, all in a touchless transaction. Across the country, different businesses are approaching it differently. I read about one drive-through pansy sale where they just had 2 employees, and it was the owner and his brother that they arranged it. You had an assigned pickup time. You come at that time to get your product. And if you come outside of that time, you will not be allowed to pick up your product and you'll have to reschedule. So they're trying to be really safe and keep this social distancing. And also outdoors, a lot of garden centers are outdoors, but we do have touchable surfaces, usually when you're doing a checkout situation. So a lot of the garden centers are moving towards different methods of paying online, and there are a lot of resources to do that well, and they're working their way through them. So fortunately, We're still sort of early in the gardening season. If you know anything at all about garden centers, it's a very, very seasonal business, and they do the vast majority of their business in April, May, and June. And they are hustling to get things listed online. But I imagine if you don't see what you're looking for at your favorite garden center on their website, call and ask. And I bet you they can tell you whether they have it, and they will put it in your order and make it available. Is it a substitute for wandering the garden center and just getting some joy? No, it's not, but we'll be back there soon. So let's make sure we keep engaging with our plant suppliers, both as we do some beautification and food gardening at our own gardens and keep our garden centers in business.
And you mentioned it, folks get quite a satisfaction from wandering around the garden center, picking and choosing through plant material, looking for that top quality material. If they're having to pick it up via curbside service as opposed to wandering the aisles, should they worry much about quality? Can they safeguard in that respect?
You know, if they're purchasing from an independent garden center, the quality is very, very high. So they have knowledgeable people. They're going to pick the very best product. And if they get to a point where the product is not up to the quality that they want to be distributing, they're going to take it off of the availability list. And just like at the grocery store, they would probably provide a substitution of something that's somewhat similar. And maybe you might make a different choice if you were wandering the garden center, but I have the utmost trust in the folks that are at our garden centers providing plants for us. And they're going to pick out something that looks really good together and that you'll enjoy.
Very well. So be assured in that respect. Other things that garden centers are doing to outreach, they're likely providing informative sources as well, are they not?
They are. So, of course, they're always a really good source of information when you're gardening. And hopefully they're pointing you back to some K-State research and extension resources. So I think if you're looking for unbiased research-based information, whether it's gardening or family management or food purchasing or nutrition, any of those topics that we cover in extension, you can search for whatever that question is and the word extension or cooperative extension, and you can find some amazing resources. Hopefully you can add the state that you're in, so add Kansas. But for instance, if you were looking for food gardening and you search that term in your browser, in your search engine, you'd come up with the Kansas Garden Guide, which is an excellent resource for home food gardening. It's easy to read, it's easy to digest, and it's probably good for homeschool lessons too. I'm thinking about that. I have a 5-year-old and a 9-year-old, so we're working through it.
Cheryl, it would be easy for folks in these very unusual times to suspend part or all of their typical gardening activity. But again, you want folks to pursue those activities as much as they normally would. And part of this is to keep those local garden centers in business. You're concerned about that.
I am concerned. I mean, with any kind of business, we're worried about the long-term viability. And I know that our garden centers in the state are worried about their own employees. So anything we can do to keep them busy is really helpful. Now, most of the garden centers are still open. So if you're practicing social distancing recommendations and you're washing your hands like crazy, if you're following all the recommendations, I think it's still really a safe place to be. A lot of these companies, like landscaping companies, for instance, they're not usually right up next to each other. So they are pretty safe with doing projects outdoors and providing plants. And most of those businesses are small, family-owned, tight-knit groups, and they know each other well, and they know how to keep track of each other's health and safety, and they know how to do the things that we've been recommending, while also helping those of us who are a bit more homebound to have a higher quality of life as well.
Cheryl, as one further thought here as to how folks could exercise their urge to garden, even though things are a little bit different right now, you would invite folks to look at the local demo gardens out there as a possible outlet.
That's right. So a lot of our county offices, most of them that have a horticulture program, have a demonstration garden of some kind. Sometimes they're at the county office. Sometimes they're elsewhere in town. Sometimes they are on the fairgrounds, public grounds. And those are spaces that folks are welcome to seek out and enjoy when they're needing some public garden space and some solace and just to enjoy being outside. But just keep in mind that they may be a little less maintained this year. They might get a little bit weedy, but that's all right. We'll be right back there fixing it up as soon as we can.
So any parting thoughts in as far as supporting those garden centers and approaching those purchases with common sense about what you do?
Yeah, so I just want to remind folks to take some time to do some planning. This is an excellent time to plan. Look to see how your local garden center or garden centers are handling it. Give them a phone call, make your list. And, I'd encourage you just to say, if there's anything else that you think I'll enjoy, throw it in my cart. I'd really be happy to have that.
Appreciate the comments as always, Cheryl. We'll talk again soon and stay safe amidst all of this. Thank you.
Thanks.
She is Cheryl Boyer, the Extension State Leader in Horticulture at Kansas State University on this week's Horticulture segment. And our time is all gone for today. Thanks for tuning in. Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.